Remember, remember the 5th of November, gunpowder treason and plot. I know of no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. Guy Fawkes, 'twas his intent to blow up the king and parliament. 70 barrels of powder below, poor old England to overthrow. By God's providence he was catched with a dark lantern and a burning match. Holla boys, let the bells ring. Holla boys, God save the king. So this poem is based upon the Guy Fawkes Day with everything that happened on November 5th. And you may be wondering, why are we talking about Guy Fawkes Day? And it's not because this channel decides more Protestant or Catholic. That's not the point here. But we mentioned actually Guy Fawkes Day in our recent Halloween video. And since we do church history here, we figured why not kind of dive into what Guy Fawkes Day is and how that kind of began the process for trick-or-treating due to some of the customs that came with it. So first off, Guy Fawkes Day is a holiday that's primarily in the United Kingdom, and even then it's not the same as it used to be, and it goes back to 1606 based on November 5th. And so who was Guy Fawkes? Guy Fawkes was born in 1570 and he died in 1606. He was born Anglican but later converted to Roman Catholicism shortly after his father's passing in 1579, and when his mother had remarried to a Catholic at this time. He served in the Spanish army, and after he returned to England in 1604, he was persuaded to join Robert Catesby and others who were conspiring to blow up the Parliament building while King James I and many governmental leaders were inside. This became known as the Gunpowder Plot. And so what was the Gunpowder Plot? The Gunpowder Plot was primarily led by Robert Catesby, who began playing this between 1603 and 1604. He was based out in Warwickshire, and his father died in 1598, which is when he converted back over to Catholicism. However, prior to that, he had married into Protestantism and was within that demographic for a time, again, until his father passed and he converted back to Catholicism. This is also shortly after the political win that the Protestants had from the English Reformation. And for those who don't know what the English Reformation is, maybe we'll do a video of that later in the future, but in short, initially began with a concern regarding canon law rather than theology or worship, because Henry VIII wanted an annulment, of which, if you know anything about Henry VIII, you know that he had a lot of wives and blamed them for providing him daughters when it is the male who provides the X and Y chromosome in order to have a male or female, but he didn't know that at the time, so he kept blaming them and wanted an annulment. But anyways, this Reformation continued to spread throughout England and started to become more intense, which led to many deaths between Protestants and Roman Catholics as they were pretty much at each other's throats. And they have been for a while already, but this just kind of made things worse because now you have someone going outside of the Roman Catholic Church, which usually had political power, and now the power for politics is up for grabs between the two of them. When Elizabeth became queen, she erred on the side of the Protestants, and she wanted to construct her government to be similar to her father's. She primarily relied on Protestants to establish her staffing for the ministry. And it was after Catesby's father died that he converted back to Catholicism. However, as the Catholic Encyclopedia notes, we unfortunately also find in him a habitual inclination towards political and violent measures. What we have here is Catesby is one that is a bit of a radical, a bit more an extremist, a bit more on the violent side. And so he supported the Essex Rebellion in 1601 and paid a fairly hefty fine. And it was after the Gunpowder Plot that he fled to Holbeck in Staffordshire, where he was killed while resisting arrest. However, he was not the only conspirator. It was Catesby, Thomas Percy, Thomas Winter, John Wright, and Fawkes were the primary ones. And this is all due to the tension that is being had between the Protestants and the Catholics, especially post-English Reformation. King James I initially made promises to the Catholic Church in Ireland when he was about to get ready to become king that he would show some leniency towards them in the areas of like fines and other extremities that the prior government had not done for them. They were a little more hard on the Catholics, and he said that he'd be a little more lenient with them. However, due to the fact that Elizabeth's ministers were still in office, it became too difficult, and some would say near impossible, to actually follow through on these promises. Not only that, but he allegedly changed his tune towards the Catholic Church, especially because he started saying things like there is no longer a need for a pope, which for a Catholic, that is a big no-no. And so this started to add some more tension and fuel to the fire between Catholics and Protestants. The fines exacted for recusancy sank in King James' first year to about 1/6 of what they used to be, but the policy of toleration was intensely abhorrent to the Puritan spirit in England, and James could not continue it with the government machinery at his command, and he began to give way. In the 5th half year of his reign, the fines were actually higher than they had ever been before, and the number of martyrs was not far short of the Elizabethan average. The great enmity between the Protestants and Catholics in the UK were continuing to grow. This enmity continued to lead to some other extremists, aka the conspirators I mentioned before, to want to get revenge against the king and parliament for the very fact that they had not lived up to their promises and were showing more persecution towards the Catholic Church. So the conspirators agreed to work in secrecy, of which they did not belong to the criminal class. They were not actuated by personal ambitions. They were of gentle birth, men of means and honor. Some were married and had children. Several of them were zealous converts who had made sacrifices to embrace Catholicism, or rather to return to it, for they mostly came from Catholic parents. On the other hand, though religiously minded, they were by no means saints. They were daredevils and duelists, and Percy was a bigamist. They were kept in a state of constant irritation against the government by a code of infamous laws against the religion and a series of galling fines. They had, as we have seen, dabbled in treason and plans of violence for some years past, and now they had formed themselves into a secret society ready to poniard any of their number who should oppose their objects. They understood their oath to contain a promise not to tell even their confessors of their plans, so sure did they feel of the rectitude of their design. And so this comes from the Catholic Encyclopedia. So for those of the Protestant side who want to say, oh, the Catholics are going to be affirming everything that Guy Fawkes did and his other conspirators, we actually have a scholarly work by Catholics saying that this is a problem. And so I think people need to recognize that on both sides. What we have here is that we have people on the Protestant side that were not showing the promises that they made and living up to them. And then we have people on the Catholic side who are responding in a way that probably wasn't the wisest, aka bombing. But even then, these were extremists. This is not a representation of the entire Catholic Church. But anyways, the plan was ultimately to blow up Parliament with the king and his government inside it. Having gained access to the palace from a neighboring cellar, Guy Fawkes planted a considerable quantity of gunpowder some months before Parliament was due to assemble. 10 days before the opening on November 5th, the plot was revealed through an anonymous letter. And so, as already stated, Guy Fawkes was then captured while he was down in the cellar getting ready to blow Parliament, and this led to the death of the conspirators. Of the 13 conspirators, 4 were killed resisting arrest, 1 died in prison, and the others were in due course executed. So Guy Fawkes was arrested November 5th, and then he was killed in January for treason and for how he sought to murder the government and by blowing up Parliament. So this leads to Guy Fawkes Day itself. Parliament passed an act in January of 1606 declaring November 5th a day of national thanksgiving, a celebration of the triumph of Protestants over Catholics, although people in Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and some parts of western and northern England continued to celebrate Halloween in the late autumn. Many English men and women eschewed it for Guy Fawkes Day. The proximity of celebrations Guy Fawkes Day followed All Hallows Eve by only 6 days and allowed for a great borrowing of traditions. Guy Fawkes Day was marked with bonfires, and celebrants carried lanterns of hollowed-out turnips that had been fashioned into grotesque faces. That's where we get some jack-o'-lantern stuff from. The eve of Guy Fawkes Day became Mischief Night across most of northern England, an occasion for pranks and skylarking, of which we mentioned in our Halloween video. Because of its close proximity to All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day on the 1st and 2nd of November, the celebration of Guy Fawkes Day had already acquired many of the traditions that had formerly been associated with them. Bonfires had been lit on the 5th of November in 1605 to celebrate the king's deliverance. The eve is still often known as Bonfire Night and then also Mischief Night. And that tradition would continue in some form or others to contemporary times. Young people worked weeks in advance to collect fuel for the great fires, and so house to house begging was involved sometimes. The children even smeared their faces with charcoal and dressed in rags, a sort of early ancestor of the 20th century American house-to-house beginning ritual of trick-or-treat. Pranks that could evolve into vandalism might take place just as they did in Irish and later American Halloweens, as we mentioned with the issue of Mischief Night, where they start to vandalize when you did not give them what they wanted or when they just wanted to prank you in general. Not only this, but young people began to beg for money for fireworks and for fuel for bonfires to then make an effigy of Fawkes and burn it. This was popular until the 19th century, when people would begin to oppose the practices that seemed too drastic and not warranted, such as effigies, of which I agree. I think this was an extreme reaction, and I understand what you're trying to do in your celebration, but still, this is a bit of an extreme. I don't think it's something that Christ would approve of. Towards the 20th century, they turned from a public setting to a more private setting, and typically now those in British cities celebrate with fireworks and sometimes parades as more of a Thanksgiving and remembrance of the fact that we didn't have an assassination. And so they kind of celebrate more the failed assassination attempt than anything else. This eventually slipped on over to America, and it would be called Pope Night, where they would do some very similar things, where they would take an effigy of the Pope and set it on fire. Some even did with King George, and some still with Guy Fawkes. However, again, people later saw that this was a bit too drastic and a bit too extreme, and they ceased to do it, as we don't really see people doing effigies of the Pope or of Guy Fawkes or of King George in the United States anymore, because why? Also, there was the revolutionary leaders, such as George Washington, who really opposed this idea because they were allies with the French, and they didn't really feel like getting into conflict with them when they're already in conflict with England. So there's that. So there is something to be said about being thankful that a plot of murder failed. However, some of the extreme holiday traditions do not seem to be warranted. We mentioned this is not to say that, hey, go celebrate it, but instead this is one of the roots of what would later be called trick or treat. We thought, why not make a video of this to kind of be a follow-up to our Halloween production. Hopefully this also reminds us that there are more Christ-like ways to handle things, even in the midst of persecution, especially if it's against other brothers in the faith, or of different people of different beliefs within the faith, whether it be between Catholics and Protestants, or different branches of Protestants, or different branches of Catholics or Orthodox, that we make sure we handle things as Christ-like as possible. That yes, sure, we should have hard truth and hard love, but also recognize that effigies and bombings might not be the best move in the world. Just saying. But I just thought this would be a really interesting video to kind of explain where Trick or Treat, one of its stems, comes from, being from Mischief Night, All Souls Day cakes, and Guy Fawkes Night, which was tied to Mischief Night in some way as well.